All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at the terrifyingly fragile origins of the biggest sporting event on the planet. Calling it the tournament that almost died sounds like a wild exaggeration for such a global juggernaut, but trust me, once we dig into its roots, you'll see it's literally the truth. I mean, today, billions of people watch it, right? The FIFA World Cup literally brings entire nations to a standstill. It crowns absolute legends. Winning this thing is the absolute pinnacle of athletic glory. But there's kind of this dark secret about how it all started, one that most modern fans have totally forgotten. So that brings us to a pretty wild hypothetical. What if it just never happened? We're going to explore how the very first World Cup faced a crisis so monumental, so incredibly severe, that it almost tanked the entire concept before a single ball was even kicked. Okay, so to get this, we gotta rewind to the 1920s. Back then, there was no true world championship for football. Sure, the Olympics had it, but FIFA president Jules Rimet, he had this massively ambitious dream. He wanted a completely new, standalone tournament just for football, uniting the best nations on Earth for one specific trophy. Now, today, that sounds super obvious, but back then, people thought it was completely impossible. Fast forward to 1929. Uruguay gets picked to host, and honestly, on paper, they were perfect. They were the reigning Olympic champs, a total powerhouse. Plus, they promised to build this massive new stadium, and get this, they even offered to pay all the travel expenses for the visiting teams. I mean, it sounded like the deal of a lifetime. But there was a huge geographical catch. Uruguay is all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe. We aren't talking about today's luxury flights, where you hop on a plane, catch a movie, and land a few hours later. Crossing the Atlantic in 1930 meant a grueling, miserable, multi-week journey on a ship. It was incredibly long, super expensive, and carried some genuine risks. So as the reality of those logistics actually set in, countries just completely panicked. Football associations were terrified of the hidden costs. And the players, remember, a lot of these guys had regular blue-collar jobs. They were stressing over how to tell their bosses they needed months off just to go play a game. You can guess what happened next. The rejections started piling up like dominoes. Literally months before kickoff, FIFA is staring down the barrel of an absolute disaster. Nobody wanted to go. They had practically zero participants locked in. The world's first World Cup was on the verge of being scrapped before it even started. And to make matters so much worse, the entire globe was plunging right into the Great Depression. Governments were barely keeping their countries afloat, which meant football associations had their budgets slashed to zero. All of a sudden, a luxury boat trip halfway around the world seemed completely tone-deaf and, frankly, absurd. Just imagine that for a second. You spend years planning the biggest tournament in football history, and then you realize absolutely nobody's coming. Jules Rimet is basically watching his live stream collapse right in front of him. He knew that if this failed, critics would use it as permanent proof that a global football tournament was just a foolish fantasy. Well, this kicks off a totally desperate race against the clock, basically a one-man rescue mission. Rimet is writing countless letters, holding these super tense, high-stakes meetings, and making massive promises. He literally launched a relentless persuasion campaign, spending hours upon hours begging football officials to take the risk. And against all odds, his sheer stubbornness actually works. A brave few finally step up: France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia. He somehow convinced this tiny handful of European nations to take a massive leap of faith, pack up their gear, and board those ocean liners. But man, just getting there was an adventure in itself. We are talking 2 full weeks at sea. You've got professional athletes trying to train, run drills, and stay in shape on the cramped wooden deck of a ship tossing around in the middle of the ocean. Picture trying to practice your footwork while the floor is literally pitching sideways. Crazy, right? And even when they finally hit South American soil, it was still a total leap into the unknown. The big question hanging over everything was, would anyone actually care? Nobody had a clue if the locals would show up, if the logistics would hold together, or if the football would even be good enough to watch. So when things finally kick off in July 1930, you've got exactly 13 teams participating. Think about what a tiny fraction that is compared to the massive 32 or 48 team mega rosters we see today. But honestly, just getting those 13 teams in one place was an absolute miracle of organization. With such a small roster, everything hinged on what happened out on the pitch. Thankfully, this pressure cooker environment totally delivered. It was the ultimate survival formula. First, you get exciting, high-quality matches. That naturally draws in passionate, roaring crowds, and that creates an absolutely electric atmosphere. The fans were instantly hooked on the magic of it all. Get this, 90,000 people. That's how many fans packed into the stadium for the ultimate climax of the tournament, the historic final between the hosts, Uruguay, and their fierce neighbors, Argentina. The stakes simply could not have been higher, and that massive crowd proved for sure that the global appetite for this was incredibly real. Uruguay takes it 4-2. The host nation wins, the entire country erupts into this massive celebration. But here's the crazy twist to this whole explainer. That final scoreline wasn't even the most important part of the day. Because survival was the real victory. The fact that the tournament happened at all was the true miracle here. They beat out logistical travel nightmares, the empty wallets of the Great Depression, and just intense global skepticism. They proved to the whole world that an international football tournament wasn't just a fantasy. It could actually work. Without the success of 1930, our sporting world looks completely different. No World Cup legends, no iconic finals, no magical moments shared by billions. If those few brave teams hadn't sailed, or if Jules Rimet had just thrown in the towel when things got rough, the most famous sporting stage on Earth would have been lost forever. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought. The World Cup, this massive event that practically stops time today, was once just an uncertain dream hanging by a tiny thread. It kind of makes you wonder how incredibly fragile history truly is, doesn't it? What other massive things that we completely take for granted today almost didn't survive their very first day?